So let me welcome everyone for this second session, which is going to be the session on the meaning of art. So if you were not aware what the meaning of art is, now it's the time to learn it. First of all, from Professor Raymond Tallis, who is a philosopher, poet, novelist, cultural critic, and physician and clinical scientist. He was called by the Economist Intelligent Life magazine one of the top living polymaths in the world. Born in Liverpool, he trained as a doctor at Oxford University and St. Thomas, London. He was a professor of geriatric medicine and retired from medicine in 2006. But he also published other things, including literature, fiction and poetry, and including philosophy, 23 books on the philosophy of mind, philosophical anthropology, literary theory, the nature of art, and cultural criticism. Among his recent publications, we find The Enduring Significance of Parmenides, The Kingdom of Infinite Space, and this one was actually translated into Dutch, Italian, Russian, Turkish, Korean, and Spanish. He published in 2011 Aping Mankind, Neuromania Darwinitis, and the Misrepresentation of Humanity, quite a challenging title. And I also like his title, Reflections of a Metaphysical Flaneur. I think that it's a very good self-description, perhaps, of him. And he is also the author of The Black Mirror, once again, an interesting title. He was an important author in clinical neurology as well as geriatric medicine, and a member and honorary doctor of 4 universities, and founder of British Geriatrics Society, and he is a patron of Dignity in Dying. A very, very wide-ranging sphere of activities. So Raymond Tallis will give the main talk for 40 minutes, which will be followed by a comment by Alicja Gescinska. She is a co-organizer of this event and a professor at Buckingham University, England. He got a master's degree in moral sciences at Ghent University, and she is a doctor of philosophy from the same university with a PhD on Max Scheler and Karol Wojtyla, with the title Freedom and Persons, a philosophical inquiry into the meaning of human agency in the thought of Max Scheler and Karol Wojtyla. She is also an author of a very successful publication, The Conquest of Freedom. And she also worked as a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton University between 2013 and 14, and taught at Amherst College in the US. But she is also a media personality, once again a polymath. She is a pundit in Belgium and the Netherlands, and a novel writer as well, publishing in 2016 her debut novel, A Kind of Love, in Belgium, and she worked close to Roger, and that's how she came to Buckingham University, where she is a professor right now. So she will give the comment. I think that's going to be a very interesting, thought-provoking event, so I don't want to take away the time from them. Ray, the floor is yours. You have got about 40 minutes or so to present your talk.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Dean. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm, of course, delighted to be here. And actually, we ended up talking about gratitude in the previous session. And I have to tell you, gratitude is something that is very central in my feelings towards Roger. As you pointed out, I'm not a professional philosopher, I'm a medic, and we got to know each other, and he really embraced me in many ways. And as a result of that, I got involved in all sorts of activities that I wouldn't otherwise have done. And in fact, being involved in this present session
wait, just a moment, because apparently the others don't see it yet.
Oh, can't see me or the slides?
Nézed, előadói nézet, képernyő.
Előadói nézet elrejtése.
Yes, if they're not seeing me, they're not losing anything, but the slides are quite
Can I ask Alicja whether you see now the slides?
No, I don't see the slides now.
Oh.
But now I see all the faces.
Yes, I can see all the faces. They're better than my slides, actually. Yeah.
I didn't see that.
A lecture without slides is like dehydrated water.
Na gyere, akkor most nézed, hogy tegyem, hogy erre az oldalra jössz.
Somebody is saying that they could see the slides before. So I think that the slides were visible when he started his talk.
Yes.
Yeah, I saw them at the beginning of the talk and then they went away just a minute ago, a few seconds ago.
PPT. Az asztalon van.
I'm sorry to be an analog old buffer in a digital world. Sort of
How about this one? Can people see this?
Well, they are very small now. You can't read them properly. It's like they're little squares.
And how about this one?
Perfect.
Can you see it?
Yes, I think
Great.
so.
There's something cut across them in the middle, but otherwise they're probably okay.
I can see them perfectly. If somebody can in the chat answer yes, full screen now. Yes.
It all looks great to me.
And Ferenc, could you kindly still do my slides? I can't seem to get any joy from here.
Yes, just say next slide and then I go there.
Well, thank you for that. Gives me a sense of power and control. But as I was just saying, we ended up talking about gratitude, and I have to say that that is central to my feelings about Roger. I owe many, many gifts to him, including the gift of being here today, which is a very great privilege. What's following is not going to be a scholarly presentation like the brilliant presentations you've heard hitherto. It's more sort of prowling round a preoccupation that I felt I shared with Roger, that we felt there was something central to our concerns. And so before I go any further, I also like to very much thank Alicja for making it possible for me to be here today. It's been terrific. So we have our second slide already. And basically, what I'm going to focus on is whether art can deliver something we might call salvation. And I think this was a theme that preoccupied Roger for much of his life. And it is proper that this talk, which like the rest of the afternoon is dedicated to his memory, should pursue this a little further. Next slide, please. Thank you. What I have to say is in implicit or explicit dialogue with Roger, though I'm very conscious that he devoted his staggeringly rich and productive intellect to many other things. He obviously wrote about other aspects of philosophy, about music as well as producing music, politics, literature, sexuality, religion. He also wrote some wonderful novels. I would strongly recommend Notes from Underground, which is an absolutely brilliant novel, and some superb short stories. His range, in short, is matched by his profundity. Next slide, please. So, what a legacy. Next slide, please, Ferenc. Thank you. And how great, therefore, is our loss. Combien de temps faudra-t-il à la nature pour refaire un cerveau pareil? Some of you may recognize as something that Rodin said when he heard that the poet Mallarmé had died. How long will it take nature to produce again a brain like this? And I think we might feel inclined to think this when we recall our loss and Roger's legacy. So to art. It's a topic that I wish I had discussed more directly with Roger than I did, because I think no one has thought more profoundly about this than Roger. Let me begin with a few caveats in this talk. I think anybody who talks about art in a general way has to deal with certain has to deal with certain awkward truths. The very notion of art is baggy, with much contested territory around the edges. And that's why it's possible in certain circles to make a reputation as an artist, simply by presenting as art something that isn't art, and provoking the response that it isn't art. And this itself preoccupied Roger. It's not the place to dwell on the shocking yawn of most conceptual art, but it was something we had very much a shared attitude towards. And there is, of course, more than one kind of art. It's reasonable to be sceptical about any theory that tries to encompass statues, novels, symphonies, netsukis, poems, and string quartets. Any such theory, anyway, must be cast in very general terms, and it won't, of course, help us to say what is good art and what is not, a long-standing preoccupation of Roger's. But that's not our task here. It's also possible to discover many different purposes that art serves, or has served, next slide please, in the history of mankind, and indeed in the history of our own lives. And this is closely connected with another point. Anyone who talks about art is entering a conversation that's been going on for a long time. Consequently, when someone offers a thesis, they're usually arguing against another thesis. So I may as well highlight some of these. These include the view that art primarily serves religious, or perhaps ethical, or therapeutic, or political, or economic functions. Art has had, and indeed for some still has, an important function in mediating between man and God, the quotidian and the eternal. Church music, sacred poetry, images of God, his angels and the saints and the afterlife have all played a crucial role in religious worship, hardly surprising in view of the prehistoric roots of art in ritual. Bach famously said that he wrote music for the glory of God and the benefit of his neighbour. What I should be saying presently is a response to the question of the role art might play in a predominantly secular society, where Bach's The Glory of God may have been marginalised by the benefit of my neighbour. Now, one of the most tenacious ideas about the benefits that art may bring to the artist's neighbour is that it is in some tangible sense ethically useful, fostering solidarity, helping us to get on better with each other, making us worthier citizens, awakening empathy, educating the imagination, and promoting political ideals or love of one's country. Unfortunately, the evidence for art making us individually or collectively more virtuous is slender. The most ardent readers of literature, listeners to classical music, and visitors to galleries do not seem to behave strikingly better than the uncultured. Few professional musicians, literary critics, and gallery curators steeped in their respective arts are latter-day saints. And 20th century history has afforded us plenty of examples, as everyone knows, of the coexistence of high culture and sickening and systematic barbarity. Music, in particular, may be suborned to the promotion of collective wickedness, sometimes assisting the transformation of a proud national consciousness into a poisonous nationalism. Another way of instrumentalizing art is to see it as a form of therapy. And as a doctor, it would be curmudgeonly not to rejoice in the capacity of music to lift the spirits of the depressed, of literature to enable the pathologically sad to break out of the prison of solitude, or dance to facilitate beneficial communication with others. But that would be reducing the place of art in human life if it were then competing with or complementing antidepressant tablets or a variety of talking cures. As for the political role of art, the rule seems to be that the better the art, the more nuanced it is. Consequently, the more remote it must be from an easy take on the issues of the day, and hence the less effective as propaganda. And effective propaganda, which knows in advance what has to be said and how it should be said, is usually mediocre art. Indeed, it can become oppressive rather than liberating. Next slide, please, Ferenc. As the English Romantic poet John Keats said, "We hate poetry that has a palpable design upon us." Next slide, please. And by the way, the idea that art should be valued by its contribution to the GDP, captured in the queasy term, or quease-making term, the creative industries, is hardly worth consideration. One word, poetry, is sufficient to dispose of that claim. Keats' value is not to be measured by his contribution to the Regency economy. Finally, art may sometimes be just another kind of fun, a distraction, another way of passing the time, up there with computer games, football fanaticism, and other pastimes. Next slide, please. None of these functions of art correspond to what I want to talk about today. Full disclosure, I'm a sexual humanist, and in the very complex ways that we were talking about towards the end of the last session, I think Roger was himself, although his humanism was rooted in a very profound philosophical anthropology. And secular humanists feel, or perhaps should feel, the lack of something that may redeem our lives, comparable to what is offered by commitment to religious belief. Certainly, speaking myself, we're searching for something that might save us. Of course, there is no shortage of candidates. Enduring love, devoting ourselves to the good of our fellow men and women, the thrill of adding to human knowledge or understanding. These are rich with promise. But when we think of what it is we need to be saved from, their promise looks less shiny. The various stings of death, loss, failure and suffering remain intact. Which brings me to art. There will be much that is unsatisfactory in what I say, if only because it is a report on an unfinished quarrel with myself, and a quarrel that would have been much better had I spent more time debating with Roger. Next slide, please. Now, since the decline of religion in the 19th century, there has emerged a tradition of looking to art to fulfill the role ascribed to religion. And Roger, of course, has expressed it beautifully. The romantic poets and painters, he said, turned their back on religion and sought salvation through art. They believed in the genius of the artist, endowed with a special capacity to transcend the human condition in creative ways, breaking all the rules in order to achieve a new order of experience. Art becomes an avenue to the transcendental, the gateway to a higher kind of knowledge. Now, while salvation through art has become a familiar mantra, it's rarely been made clear what it might mean. And what follows is a meditation on this. It's certainly not clear in what respect it provides salvation or who is saved. Is it the artists themselves? Or is it those who read, listen to, or look at what artists have created? Perhaps the most ambitious and thank you, next slide. Thank you. Oh, lovely, thank you. Perhaps the most ambitious and explicit endeavour to deliver redemption through art was in the work of Richard Wagner, to whom Roger has devoted many books, including his last book on Parsifal. And Roger described Wagner, next slide please, as one of the great humanists of modern times, but a humanist of a peculiar kind who recognised humanity's religious need and tried to make man his own redeemer, so as to ennoble the human beyond the divine. The church as theatre is turned on its head, and we have the theatre as a church. Wagner realised his vision of art in the Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art in which all the arts were combined in a spectacle in which music and drama and visual arts were equal partners. Next slide, please. The work would bring to life eternal myths that, to use Roger's characterization, acquaint us with ourselves and our condition, using symbols and characters that give objective form to our inner compulsions. Next slide, please. There are echoes here in the wonderful poem by Philip Larkin, Church Going. On arrival at the church, the poet takes off his cycle clips with awkward reverence, looks about him with self-confessed ignorance, and then leaves, reflecting that the place was not worth stopping for. And yet stop he did, and often does, wondering what to look for. He is drawn by something that can never be obsolete, a hunger in himself to be more serious, by something acknowledged in the sacred space of a church. Next slide, please. A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies. It satisfies a need for a point of convergence, like the vanishing point in a perspectival painting, from which all our goals, ambitions, duties, occupations, preoccupations can be seen in true perspective. It cannot be found within ourselves or our world, if only because our lives of necessity demand a division, indeed a dissipation of attention. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's return to Wagner's lifelong aspiration to redemption through art. Next slide, please. In his own words, it is reserved to art to salvage the kernel of religion, inasmuch as the mythical images which religion would wish to be believed as true are apprehended in art for their symbolic value, and through ideal representation, art reveals the concealed deep truth within them. It's clear, however, as Roger pointed out, that salvation through art is detached from life after death. Neither the artist nor the lover of art is protected from the fate shared by all living creatures. The extraordinary posthumous existence of Wagner has not been lived, even less enjoyed, by the genius who died in 1883. Next slide, please. And we may be sure that Shakespeare did not enjoy the year 2016, the 400th anniversary of his death, which prompted worldwide celebration of his genius. He did not enjoy it any more than the years before he was born. Next slide, please. Or an individual commemorated in stone enjoys being looked at, or the sunshine warm on its arm. Next slide, please. As Byron said of posthumous fame, it is to have, when the original is dust, a name, a wretched picturesque bust. Does art, however, offer salvation within life? If so, of what kind? From meaninglessness? Well, there is no shortage of sources of transient meanings. Can be all-consuming so long as they last, their succession filling our days with wall-to-wall meaning. Unfortunately, that so long as they last may not be very long. This trajectory was generalized by Schopenhauer. Next slide, please. Thank you. Next slide, sorry. Thank you. Our days, he said, are devoted to ending one by one the achievements that give them meaning. And here or hereabouts is where we might perhaps seek in art, if not the kind of salvation that religion promises, at least a liberation from the tyranny of endlessly being on to the next thing, the tyranny of and then, and then, and then, ever more inescapable as the distraction economy penetrates our lives. Might art offer a point of convergence that the endless succession of transient meanings and purposes seems to deny us? Might it offer, next slide please, something corresponding to what Larkin sensed on the seemingly superannuated church? The church in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies. To address this question in a way that Roger might have approved of, it's necessary to remind ourselves of the extraordinary nature of art. Next slide, please. Nietzsche, initially a disciple and then an adversary of Wagner, famously declared that without music, life would be a mistake. And there are various ways in which the arts may seem to correct the mistake of life, beyond being merely a pleasurable distraction. They may seem to transcend the transcendence of daily consciousness, more specifically to celebrate the complexity and richness of our lives and selves, and to help us realize our capacity for a certain kind of freedom. A work of art, itself the product of a heightened and connected attention, invites us more fully to experience our experiences, and thereby to satisfy a profound human hunger to be more completely there. And it's appropriate to explore this further, but before I do so, a caveat or two is in order. I want to focus on the distinctive nature and significance of the satisfaction that art might afford us, only when it is at its best, and we are at our most receptive. And that perhaps is on a minority of occasions. Next slide, please. Well, to this end, I offer a thesis about art in secular life, that it meets a need that arises out of the very nature of human consciousness, more particularly that it addresses what might be characterized as a hollowness in the present tense of human consciousness. At the heart of this thesis is the observation that we do not fully experience our experiences. As a consequence, we may be haunted by the sense that our lives are somehow eluding us. Of course, this scarcely matters when we're hungry, thirsty, or in pain, or fear, or suffering the many woes humans inflict on each other, or even when we go about our daily business of ensuring our survival, or making a living, or discharging our duties towards others. Art, it hardly needs saying, finds its ultimate place not in the kingdom of means, but in the kingdom of ends, where we seek life more abundant, to borrow the phrase from St. John's Gospel. The need addressed by art has its roots in our curious condition, For the present purposes, we might characterize it as that of being creatures that have partly woken out of the state of being an organism. Half awakened, we're constantly engaged in making sense of the world and of our fellow humans. This sense remains tantalizingly incomplete and stubbornly local compared with the world we know of or know about. We may consequently be haunted by the feeling that we have not fully realized our own existence, not fully realized that we exist, not fully realized the scale and scope of what we are and of the world we judge in. And measured against such criteria, we may judge ourselves to be in a state of existential numbness. This may present itself in different ways, but is most evident when we seek out experience for its own sake, as we do, say, on holiday, our longest sojourn in the kingdom of ends. Then we may experience a mismatch between the experience we actually have and the idea we had of it that led us to seek it out. We may spend the entirety of a holiday failing to arrive at the idea that motivated it. At the very simplest level, experience does not measure up to expectation. And at its root is something we might discuss, the intrinsic dynamism of meaning, the ing in meaning. Next slide, thank you. Let me circle around this a bit more. One aspect of our failure to experience our experiences is the sense that those experiences seem insufficiently connected with one another. They are too localized. We move from this to that, often in increasing haste. And these experiences don't add up. We may characterize this lack of connectedness in different ways. For example, that we're always small sampling our lives and our worlds, or that we have no overview on ourselves. We cannot close the gap between what we are and what we know, between our experiences and our ideas, our moment-to-moment realities and the life and world of which they are a part. It lies behind our sense that we are condemned to live in the dominion of and, or the kingdom of and then, and then, and then, in deserts of etc., of repetition, of raw variation, of succession. We seem to advance through our days, never having been fully there, or never having fully grasped our being there. Next slide, please. How might art address this hollowness in the present tense? In part, I would suggest it does so through reconciling the sensory and the intellectual, or more broadly, the articulate dimensions of consciousness, the particular experience of what is there, with the general idea or ideal of what might be there, our abstract notions with concrete instances. A work of art, as it's often been said, is a concretely realized idea, an idea as large as those that haunt our consciousness through anticipation and memory. And one approach to understanding how art unites these adversaries is through the general concept of artistic form, a complex and much contested notion, and I could spend many hours discussing this without reaching a satisfactory account, and you're relieved I will not even attempt much to do so. But let me throw out a few strikingly unoriginal Aesthetics 101 hints. Form. Form designates inner shape or arrangement of parts. The arrangement is an orderly, or sometimes calculatedly disorderly one. Form is due shape, proper figure. It may equally conform to a model, a type, or conventional pattern. This doesn't say very much about how artistic form differs from forms encountered outside of art, or indeed within art about the difference between the great and the mediocre. But let me settle for a few observations. We may think of form in art as that in virtue of which things otherwise experienced or considered separately and successively are brought together. That unity and variety which conveys the sense of sameness and difference. We may look beneath this to a stillness underneath change. And to indicate how unoriginal my ideas are, I would echo the Aristotelian idea of form as the moving unmoved. The common function or effect of formal features that unify across variety is to integrate experiences that would otherwise be separate. More importantly, and most evidently in literary art, the nears and fars of the world, booty from the four corners of the empire of experience, may be brought together. And this permits, perhaps invites us to expand into and fill the lineaments of something larger than the quotidian succession of experience. Something, in short, answering to the ideas that we hope to experience when we seek out experience for its own sake. Next slide, please. The formal structure integrates over time in music, over space in the visual arts, though we seem to unpack space from music, and we experience paintings and sculptures in time, and over a multidimensional hyperspace in referential forms such as literature. But how does this palliate the hollowing out of the present tense? It is perhaps easiest to answer this in respect of the most formal of all the arts, music, central to Roger's thinking, music which is an only weakly or secondarily referential medium, whose materials belong to itself alone, and whose ordering of parts is not significantly determined by any extra-musical reality. Any reference in instrumental music is accidental or secondary, and the music rises above it. And it's this that prompted Schopenhauer, whom Wagner of course idolized, to see music as a direct expression of the will, bypassing the world of ideas of phenomenal appearance. Form and subject matter are one. And it's not an accident that Roger wrote about music more than about any other art, even than about architecture. Next slide, please. It is why Walter Pater famously asserted that all art constantly aspires to the condition of music. Think of the relationship between musical ideas, the form in which they're gathered up, and acoustic sensations in creating the experience of melody. Each note is fully present as an actual physical event, and yet it is manifestly and explicitly part of a larger whole, because the music conforms to a form that shapes expectation and assists recall, through conformity to the rules of harmony, of contrast and symmetry, of progression and repetition. Our moments of listening are imbued with a sense of what is to come and what has passed. There's no conflict, therefore, between the form or idea of the music and its actual moments. The form to which the music conforms shines through its individual moments. So we seem to have the beginning of a reconciliation between the dynamic and static aspects of mean ink. Of course, the music has its journeys, and in great music we feel as if we travel great distances to and through a remote landscape of sound. But the journeying is never merely a piece of en route. The unfolding of the form fills and fulfills the sensation of the present moment with the past and the future, rather than undermining it with the past and the future. The music ideas, phrases, leitmotifs, recurring throughout like an involuntary memory, tie the beginning, the middle, and the end. The retrospective light, a motif casts on all that has gone before, creates the feeling that we've been arriving all the time, and that indeed we are arrived. Next slide, please. The perfected journeying that is music is continuous arrival, which is why, although it is so clearly intrinsically temporalized, it is a liberation from time. It has the forward movement in time, but in it the away and the towards are united. Next slide, please. Let me illustrate the possibility of a profound as opposed to a merely and then connectedness with a different art, literature, where a complex tale brings together a beginning, a middle and an end. At its height, literary art can give us the sense of recovering an entire world, as E.M. Forster describes so brilliantly in his essay on War and Peace. Next slide, please. After one has read War and Peace for a while, great chords begin to sound, and we cannot say exactly what struck them. They come from the immense area of Russia, over which episodes and characters have been scattered, from the sum total of bridges and frozen rivers, forests, roads, gardens and fields, which accumulate grandeur and sonority after we have passed them. This access to an entire world, an expansion to wide horizon daylight of our practical linear consciousness, is afforded also by the visual arts. Next slide, please. Consider a Rembrandt self-portrait. You see the man's life in the painted surface. As Shakespeare might have put it, thus is his cheek the map of days outworn. The and then of those outworn days is gathered up. Next slide, please. As through art we attempt to make the world more visible and intelligible, to unpeel what is hidden by familiarity in the plainness of plain light, we are to some degree returned to ourselves. What is lost in the dynamism of meaning, in the succession of our preoccupations, may be at least momentarily recalled. We may be undissipated, called back.
Megtenni azt, hogy kívánál és a mamat a én szodámban van.
Hello?
A szekrényemben, ilyen tartóba.
I can hear another voice.
Ferenc, your sound is on.
Thank you.
Just a minute, we need the accumulator is down. We have to push to the connector, the projector.
Oh, thank you. As long as the projectionist is still alive, that's the main thing.
Yes, well, you can go on, I think.
Thank you. As through art we attempt to make the world more visible and intelligible, to unpeel what is hidden by familiarity in the plainness of plain light, we are to some degree return to ourselves. What is lost in daily life, in the dynamism of meaning, the succession of our preoccupations, may at least momentarily be recalled. We may be undissipated, called back. Not completely, of course, any more than the smoke can be ravelled up and returned to the embers of the firewood and the living trees reconstructed. Now this sense of being called back overlaps, and I would submit not by accident, with the fundamental sense of the word religion, religio, which means to be bound back, to be returned. In the case of religion, this return is to God, to the foundation of being. In the case of art, the return is to, well, what? To oneself? The examples also illustrate how the experience of art, experience and emotion cultivated for its own sake, not only elevates us above the often empty and sometimes emptying haste of ordinary experience, it also enables us to realize to the full the potential freedom that our partial liberation from our biological destiny could afford us. There is a spectatorial freedom permitted by our temporal depth, by our being liberated from the present moment, illustrated by the fact that we humans are uniquely apart from nature, distanced from that which surrounds us. And this freedom is taken to a further level when we look at the images of objects removed from the places where we might be obliged to act in response to them, or where we remember a past that we no longer have to respond to. Next slide, please. Consider when a landscape is translated from its original place to a gallery where we can contemplate it. We don't have to do anything with it. This freedom is also exploited in virtual participation in the lives through narrative that engage our memory, knowledge, understanding, empathy, and emotions. We can grasp the world that has us in its grasp. Sartre's characterization of art as the world grasped by a freedom seems apt. Next slide, please. And in music, it is there in virtual causation, to use an absolutely brilliant phrase of Rogers. Virtual causation that links one note, one chord with another in the unfolding melody, a necessity that is an elective rather than an endured material necessity, an aesthetic necessity, the necessity of something that feels just right. Next slide, please. As Roger said, the fundamental musical experience is that of virtual causality, whereby one moment seems to produce the next out of its own inner dynamism. Next slide, please. It's hardly necessary, perhaps, to point out that there are pseudo-scientific accounts of the creation and appreciation of art. And I would discommend, if there's such a thing to do, false sciences such as neuroaesthetics and evolutionary accounts of art, which are entirely point missing. But they do manage, by an extraordinary economy of effort, to be wrong about neuroscience, wrong about art, and wrong about humanity, which is quite an achievement. Essentially, the significance of art is to be found not in any practical, even less biological value, but in addressing the hollowness in our consciousness, helping us to recover the wholeness of a world delivered in fragments, as one damn thing follows another. Next slide, please. That at least is one account of what art might mean in a secular society. No, it doesn't cancel our death sentence, promises no eternal life, no redemption of our losses, a point that Roger makes. But does it even work at the level I've suggested? Can hunger for a coherent life be met through experience of art? Yes, it can liberate us temporarily from time, And yes, he can gather up the scattered pieces of our ordinary existence. And yes, he can sometimes wake us up out of a half-awoken state. But alas, it cannot round off the sense of the world. And the reason for this is obvious. Next slide, please. The lived reality of art, as opposed to the idealized experience, must always break down to successive experiences. The spectre of "and" re-emerges as music, painting and literature follow one another in a succession of episodes. As each episode of enivrement ends, we return to quotidian life. This is brilliantly captured by Thomas Mann in Buddenbrooks, when Hanno Buddenbrook, the life-denying, artistically inclined son of the great mercantile family, comes out of an electrifying performance of Tristan, Wagner's supreme attempt to express the notion of redemption through art, to the banality of everyday life, represented by the wet overcoats in the cloakroom, where he waits with his ticket. The only solution to Hanno's search for transcendence seems to be his early death, which is precisely the consummation sought and found by Wagner's unhappy lovers. Nietzsche, who claimed that without music life would be a mistake, reported on how, after the music stopped, he had a peculiarly exaggerated, weary dread of everyday reality, because it no longer seemed real to me, but ominous. We do not come out of the opera house or the art gallery saved. Next slide, please. Pater himself acknowledged that aesthetic experiences were only momentary, and the exhortation to burn always with a hard gem-like flame to maintain this ecstasy seems only incompletely to exorcise the circling ghosts of and then, and then, and then. It may seem odd that we overlook this obvious truth, but perhaps it's because we tend to conflate the place of art in the lives of artists, of full-time performers or commentators, with its place in the lives of the rest of us. Next slide, please. And while one might not agree with Nietzsche's assertion that the artist is related to the lover of his art as a canon to a flock of sparrows, it is important to distinguish between, say, how Proust might have been saved through writing remembrance of things past, and how we might be saved through reading it. And even then we may entertain an idea of an artist which overlooks the drudgery of composition, an endless rehearsal and repeated performance of scrupulous vision and revision, correction and further correction. We forget how the artist's gaze is more often downward on the technical factors than upward to a transcendental source of inspiration. Next slide, please. Jorge Luis Borges famously described art as the perpetual imminence of a revelation that never arrives, as true of the artist as of the lover of art. Next slide, please. And we forget the accidental nature of the herb. Borges tries to redeem this in a beautiful but, alas, misleading fable. A man, he says, sets out to draw the world. Mountains, bays, ships, islands, fishes, rooms, instruments, stars, horses. A short time before he dies, he discovers the patient labyrinth of lines, traces the lineaments of his own face. Alas, I don't think so. Next slide, please. Of course, the transcendental experiences of observant religious believers are also episodic. Their daily lives, their practical activities, work and play, likes and dislikes, are largely godless outside of the weekly observances. They are too busy for intimations of divinity. For believers, however, there remains the possibility of, as it were, outsourcing the duty to main continuity, outsourcing it to the community, to the institution to which one belongs. There is a fundamental difference between an audience brought together by accident and a congregation held together by conviction. The fragmented personal narrative of religion in one's life is held together by that community. Yes, it may be difficult for believers to hold true to their deepest selves in a life which makes many different claims on them, and in which they are inevitably scattered over many occupations and preoccupations. And yes, even if they are not distracted from without, the inbuilt dynamism of human thought that won't keep still dissipates them. But the church is a standing reality that underwrites or guarantees the continuity of something that is engaged with only intermittently. Above all, the continuing existence of the entity, God, which is its ultimate intentional object, gives an objective underwriting to a coherence that may not be experienced, even less enacted. But of course, there is a danger to believers in outsourcing the continuity of the presence of God in their lives. He may become a marginal figure or a mere presupposition who re-emerges only when he's needed. In short, the existence of churches permits spiritual coasting. This notwithstanding, elective, even capricious engagement with particular works of art is at odds with the ache for an overarching meaning. Which works of art we encounter, embrace, visit and revisit is accidental. Paintings, symphonies, novels compete for our attention, and our attitude to them is often far from reverential. We are consumers, and we judge what we listen to, see or read. We exercise our taste and argue over the merits of different works and the way they are performed. Our stance is often that of a discerning, or sometimes undiscerning critic, even when we are applauding. While the Mass in church is of course a performance, it is not as judges of performances that we engage with it, as we would with Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. We are aware that art is the human product of human beings, even where we subscribe to the notion of the divinely inspired artist and grant artists the status of demigods. This remains the case with art, the preoccupied Roger, that aims to replace the church as holy theatre, as in the Wagnerian conception of art as a sacred space. It is true that the picture is surrounded by a frame and located in a gallery. There are wide margins around the poem which enjoin attentive silence, and the darkened silent auditorium commands undistracted attention. All of these seem to support the notion of art as sacrament, but that space is not situated in a larger ground, boundless because of its invisibility. The auditorium is next to the public bar and the cloakroom, and we may listen to the ring cycle in the comfort of our own home. The vision of the Gesamtkunstwerk at least replicates one very important aspect of religion. Religious metaphysical beliefs about the nature of the universe's creation and of the creator to whom it owes its existence can flourish only in the soil of a community enriched by rituals, worship, and a rich tradition of stories, saints, fathers, and prophets. It is a consequence of something fundamental about humanity, something absolutely central to Roger's thinking, namely that the personal is interpersonal, communal. The enduring self, personal identity, is required to be sustained by a carapace of mutual acknowledgement, shared ways of life. Time to conclude. Does art offer salvation? It does not cancel death, loss, or suffering. That we knew at the outset. Does it, however, rescue us from the realm of and then, and then, and then? Yes and no. Yes, it creates a delicious, wonderful connectedness that brings experience closer to the idea of itself. But no, if, as it must, it enters as one of the sequence of episodes that are life. And yet, many of us owe most of the richest hours of our lives, as I'm sure Roger did, to the visual, musical, and literary arts, and to the afterglow of artistic experience. Episodic, yes, but next slide, please. Let me end, therefore, with a visit to my cultural home, Germany in translation, and a quote from Hölderlin's Hyperion. To live once like the gods is enough. It's not, of course, but it gives enduring comfort to think it might be so. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention, or for the courtesy of simulating it. Now I'd like you, hopefully, to join in the quarrel between Raymond Tallis and himself. But first of all, and most importantly, I'm greatly consoled that I can't argue with Roger about this, but I'm greatly consoled by the privilege of having Alicja to respond to the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Let us go on and have the opportunity to listen to Alicja and her response. Alicja, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ray, for this wonderful talk. I could keep on listening to you all day, not only by the virtue of the topic, but because of the nuanced and the profound way you addressed this very important question, what is the meaning of art, which was Roger's life work. I think you honored Roger's and his legacy, so that was wonderful. And giving a response to your lecture wasn't easy because I agree with everything you say. So I could repeat everything, but this would be rather boring. So I won't do that. you touched upon something truly essential and a very important feature of art, which on the one hand is very logical if you think about it, but it's very often overlooked or forgot. And that is that art is a human product of human beings. And which explains, of course, a lot why there is so much rubbish and kitsch around us. It's a human product after all. And yet, at the same time, there is something special about this product, about art. Something that is transcendental, almost metaphysical, makes us transcend our ordinary lives. There is a kind of mystery, the same mystery which we can find in friendship, love, and erotic feelings. And Roger often wrote about all those things and about the mystery in them. Art is essentially personal, and the personal is essentially interpersonal, as you rightly have said, and which was very important to Roger to keep on repeating that and explaining that. In my response, I would like to single out one specific paragraph from your lecture, and in particular, one essential word, as I believe it goes really to the heart of the meaning of Roger's conservatism, of Roger's philosophy. And this word is judgment. You said, and I will quote you now, "We are consumers and we judge what we listen to, what we see or read. We exercise our taste and argue over the merits of different works and the way they are performed. Our stance is often that of a discerning critic or undiscerning critic, even when we are applauding," unquote. So we judge, we exercise our taste. Our stance is that of a discerning critic. And why is this so important? Why was it a pillar of Roger's conservative philosophy or just his philosophy? And also the question, how do we become discerning critics? So those are very important questions to me, and I want to keep on revolve around them in this very short talk. I think that judgment can really be called a fundamental pillar of Roger's philosophy. And I think it's maybe a bit overlooked or underestimated, because when people talk about Roger and Roger's conservatism, they talk about oikophilia, which is correctly, of course, shaping of the world around us, talking about home, national loyalty, about beauty and free speech. But I think in all those matters, we have to talk about judgment. In 2009, Roger wrote a very short essay about judgment, which was published in Catholic Education and also in the American Spectator, and had the title, "Farewell to Judgment." And the importance of judgment, we can find that idea throughout Roger's entire oeuvre, in particular in his books about aesthetics, music, and architecture. Those books are expressions of judgment themselves, and they invite us to exercise our own judgment. That is one of the reasons why Roger was so critical of our zeitgeist, and we often complained together, which was one of the nicest things about the friendship, is that you could complain about the world together, but of course with good arguments. Because we live in a world in which judgment is not appreciated anymore. I'm sure you all know that it's fashionable and even required very often to be non-judgmental. It is seen as a virtue. And indeed, many of our contemporaries said farewell to judgment. But this attitude opens the doors to something that Roger found really terrible. And we all should find it terrible because it opens the doors to value relativism. If we lose the ability to judge, we lose a lot. We cannot recognize anymore the distinction between what is true and what is false, what is beauty and what is ugliness. And eventually, we won't be able to recognize the distinction between good and evil. Hence, Roger was deeply committed to the importance of judgment, to cultivating our ability to make proper judgments. And one major way in which we cultivate this ability is through art, through listening to music, through looking at paintings, through reading, and also reflecting and discussing about what we are listening to, what we are looking at, and what we have read. In order to cultivate the art of judgment, we need to train ourselves in the judgment of art. And I will say it for the second time because it's very important. In order to cultivate the art of judgment, we need to train ourselves in the judgment of art. In his essay, Farewell to Judgment, Roger already expressed that this goes to the core of our education as well. We should be trained and train others in the judgment of art. And the responsibility of this training lies in the humanities. The humanities bear a huge responsibility. Humanities used to be central in our education. But as we all know, today that's not the case anymore. There is a great disdain towards the humanities. And why is that? Because the focus is not on value anymore, but the focus in our lives is on profit, on utility, on economic benefit. And education prepares us for the labor market and not for a good life. And that's why Roger was so critical of universities and of many educations. Humanities are under pressure, and this should worry us. And we can see that we can give a lot of examples where we can see that a lot of departments of foreign languages have had to close the doors. Roger as well complained about the fact that the whole world is speaking one language, which is English, like on the continent, in the European Parliament, etc. And also complained that we neglected some kinds of knowledge. For example, what is the relevance of studying 19th century Hungarian poetry? Some people really don't see the point of it, while it's very important. Another thing where you can see that now that humanities are not valued enough is that, for example, in Belgium, they wanted to lower the student fees for engineering and exact sciences, but doubling the student fees for humanities. Crazy, I know, but politicians sometimes are thinking out loud, which is very painful for us, and so on. So there are a lot of examples, and I'm sure you all know that humanities and philosophy is under pressure. But what do we lose if we mistreat the humanities? I think we can say that we mistreat ourselves, because if we mistreat the humanities, we risk to lose the way to self-understanding, the way to understand others. Because art is an expression of the human condition. We can learn about different cultures, and we can also get the ability to sympathize with others. We lose what Roger beautifully called knowledge of the human heart. Roger was like the master in phrasing things like perfectly. And Ray has already asked a very crucial question in his talk. Does art, thinking and talking about art, improves us morally? Does it, as Ray has asked, foster solidarity, help us to get on better with each other? Does it make us worthier citizens and awakens empathy? Those are very important questions. Does art do that? And Ray has answered correctly, I think. Unfortunately, the evidence is slender. And I agree with you, Ray, on that. But on the other hand, I want to answer this question a little bit differently. Not that the evidence is slender, but also that the counter-evidence is abundant, in the way that art also holds a huge potential, and art can be an exercise in empathy, and it can increase the knowledge of the human heart. So it has that potential in it, and that potential is not a guarantee towards something, as you also rightly said. It's not because you go to a concert, you leave the concert hall as a half saint or as a saint. Of course you don't. But something might happen, and happens in human hearts, that open them to music or to art. But as always, there are little guarantees in the moral domain. And I want to turn to a French philosopher, Vladimir Jankélévitch, who was a philosopher of music. And he too thought a lot about music and also about morality in music. And when he was asked the question, does music make us better human beings? He answered, music can disarm our hearts on the precondition only that you have a heart. Mm-hmm. So, I think that's a very good answer. In other words, if you're a heartless person, art, music, literature won't make you better. But if you have that potential in you, art can help you to grow as a human being. Now, to return to what we lose if we treat the arts and the humanities with disdain, I think most of all, we lose the ability to judge and to cultivate our judgment. But then the question remains, but how do we judge? How do we educate our soul? What are the criteria of judgment? For example, how do you evaluate Shakespeare or a piece of art, a novel, whatever? It's very difficult. And Roger said, you can look to it and you can judge on the profundity, on the beauty, on the truthfulness. And very important, politics should be irrelevant. It would be very silly if someone would ask the question, what would Shakespeare think of Trump? Or would he be on the left or on the right? Or what would he think of Brexit? And then that would influence our view on his oeuvre. That would sound very silly. I quote Roger, when judgment is marginalized or forbidden, nothing remains save politics. But if we look what is happening now in the world, then very often we look through the political lens to art. Think about J.K. Rowling, what is happening to J.K. Rowling. People want to burn her books, ban her books, not by making use of their judgment to a piece of art, but because of her views on men and women and transgender. And that is a very worrisome evolution. But of course, it's easier to take offense than to think. And that worried Roger very deeply. Mm. Roger said, real judgment is a matter of taste, and taste is more than a matter of taste. Taste is developed through aesthetics criticism. And this process should be held by teachers who introduce you to the great masters of mankind. Roger even calls it the rites of passage from adolescence to adulthood. And everyone who is a little bit acquainted with Roger's philosophy knows how important rites of passage are. So what you think is beautiful at the age of 3, and you think that Peppa Pig is a wonderful TV show, well, that's very innocent and sweet. But if you would repeat that at the age of 30, then that's very worrisome. So we grow and our taste should change with time. It's that rite of passage. But saying that taste is a matter of maturity has become an offense in our world. When I said that about Peppa Pig, maybe some of you smiled and said, of course, that would be silly if somebody would say Peppa Pig is a wonderful TV show, being age 30. And yet, if you say that taste is a matter of maturity, then people tend to, be careful. This might be offensive. And Roger experienced that when he was teaching in Boston. And he was teaching about classical music. And he said, when I was teaching about classical music as a historic artifact, the students were listening and nodding. But then when I started to criticize pop music, they said, you can't do that. You can't say something negative or speak in different words or in different ways about, for example, the Spice Girls. Schubert and Spice Girls must be treated as equals. or heavy metal is just as good as heavenly music of Handel's Messiah. But the result of that is that we ruin an important rite of passage. And our culture starts to suffer, already suffers actually, from an infantilization. We live in a world of the Kardashians as our new role models. We used to value expertise. Now people tend to value popularity. So we lost the distinction very often, or many lost distinction of what is true and what is phony, what is art and what is kitsch, and what is good and bad. We had just very recently an example in the Netherlands where fashion influencers' opinion on the pandemic and on the virus was equaled with the expertise of virologists. So this really becomes dangerous at times, because when millions of people will listen to a fashion influencer when it comes to the pandemic, then this might even, this is a very tangible thing, but there are numerous examples of that. And I want to end with a quote of Roger, of course. The true conservative cause when it comes to university ought to be the restoration of judgment to its central place in the humanities. So I will repeat, the true conservative cause when it comes to the universities ought to be the restoration of judgment to its central place in the humanities. And I almost agree with it, almost, because I don't think it's a true conservative cause. I think it's a cause of everyone who is committed to a better world.
Thank you, Alicja. That was really an answer and also a question for us all. So we have got about 20 minutes and we have got a number of questions. If you don't mind, I read them out and then you can return to it, unless Ray wanted to say something just as a direct response to Alicja.
I need to say, I obviously very much agree with Alicja. I'm very interested in the quotation about taste, that judgment is a matter of taste, but taste is more than taste in a way. And I was thinking one of the things that preoccupied Roger, I think, was that taste really comes through attention. And it's a pure attention. You're willing to listen to things, to get yourself out of the way, so you can subordinate yourself to what this otherwise alien artist or whatever might be performing. And I think that's one of the fundamental, plays into something fundamental of Roger, which is about a kind of personal piety, willing to be, as it were, interpersonal, get yourself out of the way. You can only develop taste by being willing to do that.
Exactly. Yes.
When you put your finger on that, I felt you were really touching something that was absolutely central to Roger's ethos and his philosophy.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Ray, for this. And now the questions and comments. David Bunikovsky. So, from aesthetics to ethics, from ethics to religion, from a high culture to religion, from art to God, it seems like that. Question about Scruton to Professor Raymond Tallis. Was his path, philosophical investigation, a Greek or a Platonic way? What is beautiful is also good. This is harmony of aesthetics and ethics here. That's how we understand Platonism, and the question is whether Scruton was following this Greek or Platonic way. Then Jim wanted to ask if this essay, Farewell to Judgment, was published somewhere else, as the American Spectator keeps it behind the paywall. And Jack, a guest, thank you for the illuminating talk. I'm a fisheries biologist in the United States and feel so lucky to have found Sir Roger's work. I would describe it as in many ways, when I introduce literature, poetry, and classical music to my more scientific friends, I'm often met with the claim that such things are not relevant. How would you, and that's the question, how would you argue that literature, poetry are relevant and indeed important? That's his question. And then Jonathan Johnson, Question for Raymond and or Alicja. Thank you for both for your talks. Knowing Scruton's engagement with Kant, how influential might we assume Kant's third critique was in his emphasis on judgment, as Alicja mentions, and on the aesthetic as a path to telos, albeit fleeting or false, as Raymond discusses. So Kant's third critique and that concept of judgment that Kant used, whether that was relevant for Roger. And the final question, JK, I feel artists as much as students on campuses are left without conservative judgment, meeting only left-leaning voices, saying what are shoulds and should nots in the art life. Isn't that conservatives look too much to the past instead of shaping our world here and now by showing appreciation to good artists and loud judgment of others? So that this is the list of questions, and take whichever you would like. We have got about a quarter of an hour for discussing all these and more, if possible. Ray, Alicja?
Gosh, perhaps we ought to have a division of labour. Could Alicja have the difficult questions, and can I have the straightforward? Is that okay? That seems
That's very kind of you and tasteful.
Actually, I mean, I speak as a doctor now, as it were, trying to diagnose Roger and how the bits hang together. I mean, I think he was more coherent than any other philosopher over a huge range. But I don't know whether, like any of us, he was entirely coherent. So your particular question about ethics and aesthetics, did he think that the beautiful was good and the good was beautiful? Or indeed, let's bring in the third character, beauty is truth and truth is beautiful. I don't know. I think he was quite tormented is too strong by the potential separation from truth, from the aesthetic and the ethical. I think he felt he'd found places where they converge, and indeed in conservative thought, but I don't know how wholly and 100% convinced he was of it. I think he's a man who was always quarrelling with himself. He's described as a conservative philosopher, but I think his beautiful books came out of a quarrel with himself. So I'm wriggling out of that question by saying I'm not too sure that I know, but Alicja, you have a deeper understanding of this and more perhaps grasp on Roger's philosophy, and I just wondered what you felt.
Well, I would want to answer the question about the student, I think, or somebody asks that he or she feels that they are left without conservative judgment. And when I read that, like conservative judgment is just judgment. And for Roger, judging was a conservative stance. I don't think it's, if you would say that the rite of passage, maturity is maturity, or you're mature or you're immature person. Of course, Roger would say that that being a true conservative is being mature, but you can. I think there is a danger there, and it happens quite often that people mix things up as if loving classical music is something that conservatives do, and because people have almost childish understanding of that, they think that if somebody loves conservative classical music, he immediately is a conservative, or and that people on the left, they like different types of music. And I think this politicizes something that should not be politicized. Judgment should be valued all over the political spectrum. It's a process of growth and understanding and appreciating art. You can of course appreciate art and be mature about and have a judgment, and be on a political spectrum on the left. So I find it problematic to call judgment a conservative judgment. if it's a judgment, is a judgment. I mean, in a mature judgment, let's say it like that. And being non-judgmental is a sin also on all sides of the political spectrum. And another reason why I think it's important not
we cannot hear now you, Alicja.
No?
Can you repeat?
That I think it's dangerous to mix politics with art. That is just a dangerous combination to do so. Did you hear that?
Yes, we did.
Ah, okay. So not now. Over to you, Ray.
Well, I mean, just picking up on that, I agree with you entirely. It seems to me, for example, if you think of Schiller's, letters on the aesthetic education of man, I mean, clearly he wasn't conservative in his own time, although a lot of what he said are things that current conservative philosophers would agree with. In fact, he was regarded as a bit of a wild card, having made his reputation with The Robbers and that very subversive play. I mean, those letters on the aesthetic education of man are absolutely wonderful as philosophical anthropology and art judgment, and I don't think you could locate him on as being either conservative or radical right wing or left wing. At his time, he was seen as a very rather left wing figure. So I just have to agree with Alicja. It's you can't sort of map these two things together. You can't couple them together.
Can I just join here and answer a question which was raised as well about Kant, because I think that might be useful. The question is whether the third critique might be relevant for the concept of judgment in Scruton that Alicja and also Ray pointed out was so important. And I think that the answer is yes. Why? Because, of course, the concept of judgment in the third critique is, it's based on an assumption that human judgments are public affairs, not political, but public affairs. In what sense? In the sense that you can only judge correctly if you are able to sympathize with the others. If you are able to take the position of the others and look at the thing from their perspective as well, and look from their perspective your views. And that's the way how you learn. That's the impartial spectator thing in Adam Smith, adopted to the problem of aesthetic judgment, that you try to understand the work of art from the perspective of the perfect critic. And as soon as you are able to do that, if you are able to join the club, then you will be able to see it in a correct light. And of course, there is an even further step here, because that's only public affairs. Politics in a very general term, but we can add a further dimension to it if we look or connect this idea to the interpretation that was given to it by Hannah Arendt in her late work, when she considered the third critique as a starting point for a political philosophy based on the concept of judgment. So I absolutely agree with Alicja that there is this crucial concept there, which is elaborated by Kant and then worked on by others like Hannah Arendt. And actually, the concept itself, as soon as we see that it's the same mechanism in art, in public life, in politics, then we see that the human being is a zone political. And that way we keep it within the tradition, within the great tradition, within the framework of the great tradition as it was started by Plato and Aristotle. And in that sense, it is conservative. It's a question what we mean by conservatism, and I think that one aspect is that it's a party doctrine and an ideology. Another one is that you see the human culture as a continuity, as a long story, built from generation to generation. And I think that that Schiller, what Schiller does is actually based on Kant on the one hand, and on the other hand, elaborating on it and tracing it back to the ancient concept. And well, judgment for Aristotle is of course phronesis, practical wisdom. And in that sense, we are elaborating a concept which has got such a variety of uses in different contexts, in different human activities. But maybe I'm misusing the opportunity to talk too much.
Actually, it's interesting, the word judgment, isn't it? Because we do tend to give it a rather broad reference. For example, something very important in medicine is clinical judgment. And it's got nothing to do with political judgment and nothing to do with aesthetic judgment. They are really very widely different things. Being a good clinical judge is a marker of maturity, and I guess likewise in relation to politics and aesthetics. But it is a strange term, isn't it? It can be used so broadly to encompass things that are fundamentally different and heterogeneous.
Well, fundamentally different as far as their application is concerned. But as far as the human aspect is, the relationship between the particular and the general, between the momentary and the universal, it has got similar schemes. And I think that Aristotle, when he points out that, Pericles, the politician, was doing something similar to a good physician, actually, means something similar or something that is connected to this discussion of ours. Can I read out some contributions from the chat box? Jim Hankins has finally found the Scruton essay. Can you share with us where you found it, Jim? And maybe he doesn't hear us now. Then I go on to David Bunikovsky. I think that conservative judgments mean conservative opinions about such issues like abortion on demand, etc. Just thinking. Is it just thinking or only thinking? This last sentence, just thinking, is not obvious, but David, if you want, you can join the discussion. If you unmute yourself, you can reply by words as well. And in the meantime, Jim Hankins has shared with us the essay on judgment, where we can find it on the internet.
Do you hear me?
Would you like to?
Yeah.
Join us and explain what you mean by just thinking?
Do you hear me? Okay. So
Please reply.
Just
yes,
thinking.
we hear you, David.
Okay. So just thinking was
Hello.
only thinking.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Akkor szólnál. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I hear.
Yeah. I can hear you. David, I can hear you speaking.
Yes, me as well.
Okay.
Just a minute. Most gyorsan írok valamit, akkor.
Ferenc, I think you need to mute your microphone a moment.
One minute. 1 minute.
David, I think you can ask your question.
Okay, thanks, Alicia, to take it over. David is here. Okay, David.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah. Well, so I was just wanted to say, in that terms, moral right or something, just only thinking. But I was thinking about this concept of conservative opinions, conservative ethical opinions in such issues like abortion, euthanasia, pornography, prostitution, same-sex marriages, and so on. So this person who mentioned the concept of conservative judgments probably meant conservative ethical opinions in socially and morally controversial matters like abortion and so on. This is what lacks probably in at the universities, because the universities are very liberal and liberal agenda is dominating in all the universities in the West, I think. So this is what this person probably meant. Conservative judgments meant conservative ethical opinions about such issues like abortion and so on. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for explaining that. But when I give my talk, and I think when Ray was giving his talk, we weren't talking about difficult ethical issues, but really about art, about how to listen to Schubert or what Schubert. So you can appreciate Schubert and your stance on abortion can be totally different. Like two people can have a totally different view on abortion and appreciate or understand Schubert in a profound way. You don't need to say what you call conservative opinion to appreciate or be mature or to have a mature judgment when it comes to art. I think those are two distinct things. And I understand that a lot of people are worried that universities nowadays are very progressive and liberal and that there are not enough conservative voices, though whatever the voices are at the universities now, I don't think it's the task of professors, liberal professors or conservative professors, to teach the students what they should think about abortion anyway. It's the students themselves that should think for themselves about it. Otherwise, you're indoctrinated. And that it goes against the whole point of education. So maybe you're not exposed enough to certain views, but if you go to universities to have the same view than your professor in the end, then I think you miss the chance of real education.
Yeah. I mean, in many ways.
Yes, Ray?
Sorry, I just say, I mean, the question illustrates the fact that judgment applies to a variety of things. And clearly your judgment as to whether abortion on demand is appropriate or not appropriate will, as Alicja says, be quite different from your aesthetic judgments, and even may well be different from your political judgments as to, say, how big the state should be, and so on and so forth. There isn't always a total correlation between your position on abortion, say, and your position on the size of the state, and even less your position on Schubert versus Elvis Presley. So I do feel that the word judgment is one of those words that has got a long history, and in the course of that history, it's picked up a lot of territory, which may not hang together very coherently.
Can I just say defense for David, if he allows me? I think that there is a chance to defend it if we refer to this non-judgmental attitude as a mainstream attitude nowadays. And Alicja, you emphasize that this non-judgmental attitude excludes the possibility of proper judgment and finding the truth. And so, in a sense, there is a need to get over this non-judgmental understanding of human knowledge. And I think that that might sound like a conservative position. And in that sense, Roger could argue for non-judgmentalism as a problem in these days, because of course then you cannot judge not only the work of arts properly, but political matters, moral matters, and eternal matters. So in that sense, there is an agenda here for conservatism, I guess. If you think that one more question might be addressed, is the question by Albert Schotter.
Sorry, may I just add one comment on this?
Sure, Sebastian.
If you don't mind.
Sure. It's your turn.
Only that, again, just to dissent and to offer something in defense of the idea of conservative per se judgment. I think that you don't make judgments on things. You don't make judgments in isolation. You make judgments based on a whole array of philosophical assumptions, many of which will actually be uncriticized by the one who makes the judgments. Many of these assumptions will not be explicit. And so when, for example, somebody who is socially, culturally, politically, etc., liberal, the judgments that they are going to make will necessarily be made with the foundation of a number of uncriticized assumptions, which are going to condition the judgment that's been made. And this is going to be exactly the same for the conservative. So when the conservative wants to make certain judgments about the merit of a particular work of art, for example, he's going to make that judgment saying, well, with all of the social and moral and philosophical assumptions that the conservative brings to that judgment. And that's exactly why people wanted to go and study under Roger Scruton instead of Peter Singer or whatever, right? Precisely because they know they're going to get something different from Roger, because as a conservative, he brings to his judgments a number of assumptions which they think are the right kind of assumptions, rather than, say, somebody else. So I think there is something to be said about the notion of a conservative judgment rather than judgments in isolation.
I see. So this is judgment with some conservative preconditions or preliminary concerns, and the same is true about the liberal judgment, that there are behind it certain preconditions which can be labeled as liberal, and not the result of the judgment, but these preconditions would make them either liberal or conservative. Okay, if that we can suspend this, of course it could be answered and we can go on, but I wanted to ask the last question for this session, which is, can either of you, I think it's Alicja and Ray, give us an idea of what Scruton's relationship with Iris Murdoch did for his philosophy? This is the question by Albert Schotter. Iris Murdoch.
What an interesting question. I mean, obviously, I'm sure he would have shared her view of the sovereignty of good, which is central to Iris Murdoch's thinking. But beyond that, I just don't know. It's a factual question. Alicja, do you have any sort of knowledge?
Well, I think his relationship to Iris Murdoch was a bit complex and a mystery. Professor Fiona Ellis, who is specialized in Iris Murdoch and also was a very close friend of Roger, she still has questions when it comes to the relationship with Iris Murdoch and Roger, because she thinks they have a lot in common, but he never recognized her in a way. But then Roger, wrong. I mean that he was more interested to. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Not really correctly. Just the last sentence. Repeat it, please.
Okay. So he was really, as it is already said, he was really a seeker, and he tried to find his own answers. And he was not somebody who or take something from somebody else, but really try to find his own answers to the big questions, Roger. And he knew her personally, that we know, but there were more differences between them, I think, than similarities.
And who is
it's an open question.
Yes.
Alicja, who is the person who wrote about the two of them? Fiona?
Yeah, Ellis.
Ellis.
I'm not sure if she has wrote about Fiona Ellis. She will write about, and I will write her in the chat box. I will write her name.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Sorry.
Yes. Yes.
Ray wants to add something to it, if it's okay. I want to hear what Ray wants to add. If it's okay, Ferenc.
I mean,
Yes.
I think there's first of all that there is that I mean, Iris Murdoch was a recovered left-wing person like Roger. She moved to the right, and for the same sorts of reasons. Her book, The Sovereignty of Good, I'm sure is one that Roger would embrace. But interestingly, I would strongly recommend Roger's fiction for those who haven't read it. But there's a collection of very late short stories called Souls in Twilight, and the portraits of those characters, they could have been characters who strayed from some of Iris Murdoch's novels. That in any way doesn't reduce their originality. They're absolutely brilliant portraits. But in a way, I think, Alicia, do you think Iris Murdoch could have imagined some of those souls in Twilight, couldn't she? No.
Yeah, sure, they were both brilliant, so.
They're both fantastic writers. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing with Roger. He could have had a posthumous reputation just on the basis of his fiction. And that's a small part of his output. It's just extraordinary.
Indeed.